welcome to the open house on Slow Streets in Alameda. And tonight, I'm going to just talk through a few items, and then we'll get into hearing from everybody here and what you think about the Slow Streets program. I'll start with how we got here with Slow Streets, and then explain what Slow Streets are, and then we'll dive into hearing from everyone here. I'm going to skip over the polls for now. So how did we get here? As everyone knows, over a year and a half ago, we had the shelter in place due to COVID-19 pandemic. And that is really what started the Slow Streets program. A year and a half ago, as I'm sure everybody is very aware, gyms and parks and pools and workplaces and schools closed. And so suddenly people were at home, people were needing places to go and get fresh air and exercise and get around. And yet we still had these physical distancing requirements, and people were also just being very cautious. And so we saw a need for doing something like this, and were inspired by other cities like our neighbor Oakland in developing a Slow Streets program. And the council did endorse that program in May of 2020. So just to define slow streets, these are streets that are closed to through auto traffic, but local traffic is allowed. So any traffic that has a destination along that block, such as a resident or a visitor of theirs, or a UPS delivery person, those automobiles are allowed to travel on the street, but others who maybe want to travel for 5 or 6 blocks would be encouraged and discouraged from using these streets and encouraged to use another one. So they are open though for people biking to be able to bike continuously on the streets. The original program objectives are to create more space for people to safely walk along these streets, but to have physical distance. They're creating places that people of all ages and abilities can safely be physically active, so be out on the street to get exercise, whether it's scootering, rolling, running, walking. They're providing safer and more sustainable ways for people to get around, hopefully encouraging people to get around in ways other than an automobile. And this program was approved by the City Council through this October, so October 2021. There were 5 slow streets that have been implemented over the past year and a half, actually. And these were all implemented in phases. So we started with a pilot phase last April, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And you can see in light blue, those were a segment of Pacific and a segment of Versailles. And then a month later, we moved into phase 2. That's in the red here, extension of Pacific and then Santa Clara. And then another month later, in June of last year, we added San Jose Avenue and then extended Versailles. And it's down to Calhoun. It used to be down to Otis, but now it's down to Calhoun. And then just this past June, so a year later, we added a short segment in West Alameda on Orion Street. So many people ask how we picked these streets and why we picked these streets over other streets. Almost all of these streets are either existing bike routes or they are future bike boulevards. And those are streets that are intended to be comfortable places for people to bike, and they're recommended in our draft active transportation plan recommendations. We also picked streets that were generally well used for walking and biking already, and people were used to using these. Streets with lower traffic volumes, we obviously avoided like high traffic streets such as Lincoln. We avoided streets with transit routes on them. We also intended, as it got built out, to build a more connected network. Earlier this year, the council directed us to kind of put a pause on extending the program further, but that was kind of why we started having these streets around town, with the idea of eventually having a connected network. We also heard from the community. We did a round of surveys when we started the program over a year and a half ago, and we asked people where they thought we should have slow streets. And so we took all of that, and that's how we ended up with the slow streets that we have now. This map is just to show you for the active transportation plan draft recommendations, what the bike boulevard networks are in that plan. And you can see this in the dashed pink lines. This was presented a year ago as our draft recommended bikeway network. And you can see, you have to look a little closely, but that San Jose, Versailles, Pacific, for example, are on here as recommended bike boulevards. So what was done to these streets specifically to make them slow streets? This is a picture of what it looks like, and I'm sure most of you have seen this already. We installed barricades with signage on them. We installed cones to kind of make this more visible. And then we also distributed some yard signs to neighbors. We also have been looking to the future, and we have been continuing to maintain them and expect to continue to do that at least through the end of October. We'll see what council recommends for after that. There had been plans to do some additional kind of beefing up and fortification of these of the slow streets, and we've done planning for that, but due to some delays, we haven't implemented those yet, but we are looking at adding some additional barricades, replacing the cones, which, as you can see in this picture, tip over or disappear, with something a little more permanent, a flex post that can be glued to the ground. We've been looking at making the visibility at intersections better. That's something called daylighting, where you add red curbs to the intersection so that all the users, including people on bike, people walking, people driving, can all see each other better. So that's something we're looking at doing also. And then in a few select locations, we're looking at adding speed cushions. We actually will be doing that on Orion Street soon. And that's the one street we've selected for that. And then to test that out. And then we also want to test out temporary neighborhood traffic circles. So these are small circles with the goal of slowing the traffic that's crossing the slow street. So at busier intersections, these would be put in. They're fairly inexpensive to put in, and we want to test these out at a few locations to see what the community thinks of them and how they impact the usability of these slow streets. And potentially in the future, these will be bike boulevard streets, and we could put in more permanent traffic circles if they're working out. Like I said, I'm skipping the polls for right now. So this is what we did over the past year, and where are we today? We know that 78% of Alamedans are vaccinated as of now. Over 90% have received at least one shot, which is amazing that we're gotten to that point, and that's good news. The bad news is that, as we know, because of the Delta variant, cases are increasing, and we have indoor mask requirements again. And so things are a bit fluid right now. We also don't quite know where travel patterns are going to land, and people's work their work schedules, and what's going to happen with all of that in response to not just immediate COVID, but also just kind of this new environment that we're in now and that we've been living in for a year and a half. And then lastly, as I've mentioned the active transportation plan a couple times, this is something that we put on hold to implement this COVID-19 program and other programs, and we want to pick that back up and complete that plan. And that plan will be telling us, we'll be recommending these bicycle boulevards and other facilities and other programs, and also giving us prioritization on where to focus our efforts for improving walking and biking in Alameda. And we're also finishing up a Vision Zero action plan as well. And both of those plans have some relation to slow streets, because these are streets that are safer, and they're also part of a larger network of walking and biking streets. So as I mentioned, the City Council has approved this program through the end of October. And so right now we're doing a full program evaluation in order to develop recommendations that we will take to the City Council for them to decide what we should do next with these streets. We're doing extensive community engagement. We have a survey available right now online. We've already gotten over 700 responses, and that will be up through August 29th. We're doing 4 virtual town halls like this one. We're also looking at a lot of different traffic data. We're looking at auto traffic data, both pre and post pandemic and post slow streets. We're looking at traffic volumes and speeds. We're looking at streets that may have gotten the traffic that was on the slow street, some cars that might have diverted to parallel streets. And then we're also doing counts of people walking and biking along these streets to see what the impact of these changes have been. We'll be looking at collision analysis as well, and if there's been any change in collisions on these streets. And then we're also reaching out to all of our city departments that have some jurisdiction over the roadways or use these roadways in order to find how this is working for them. As I mentioned, we'll be developing recommendations based on all of this input, and the first place we'll be going with those recommendations is our city's Transportation Commission on September 22nd. And then after that, we'll get their input and recommendation, and then we'll go to the City Council in October. So these are some ways to provide input that I've already mentioned. Everything is linked from our webpage, the slowstreetsalameda.org webpage. And you can also subscribe to our mailing list to stay updated about what we're doing with Slow Streets and also the Commercial Streets program. And so you'll know how this recommendations are when they get presented and how you can provide input, not just here, but to the Transportation Commission and to the City Council. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you.